Welcome to the Space's Net Carbon Zero podcast. I'm Alex G. As part of Space's year of Net Carbon Zero events, we're going to be talking to 4 leading thinkers and practitioners, finding out just how they found themselves to be in this field, why the work they do is so important, and fundamentally, what do we need to do to support the drive for net carbon zero? Today, we're talking to Sheryl French, Programme Director of the Energy Investment Unit at Cambridgeshire County Council. Sheryl, you have 20 years experience working in local government at senior positions covering the environment, regeneration and growth. You have a physics degree from King's College London and a research master's from the University of East Anglia in strategic environmental assessment and policy decision making. For over a decade, you've focused on analysing growth plans in Cambridgeshire for their future carbon impacts and mobilising local energy investment into renewable and energy efficiency investments to ensure the council is delivering sustainable and low carbon futures. Sheryl, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Alex. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us, Sheryl. And interesting note that I was wondering through just reading out the briefing is that energy investment is an interesting area, and there is a clear dichotomy between investment and returns on investment and payback and sustainability and environmental benefits. Where is the line for you in marrying those two themes?
Oh, now that is a tricky question. Okay, so when I look back into what we're trying to achieve on the environment and the fact that we're in this position of significant global warming of the environment through greenhouse gas emissions and the burning of fossil fuels, I think you have to look at what are the new investments and solutions that you're investing in. Will they cut fossil fuels overall, both through the production process and the operation of something? And that if on balance, that is going to cut emissions and there is a benefit, a wider societal benefit, then there's an investable project. And it's a project which will bring public good and public value. So I think for me, in terms of delivering on energy projects at the moment, the biggest challenge that we're facing, I suppose, is just how to make projects stack up financially when let's say the regulatory environment is currently still organized around the burning of fossil fuels. So gas and oil are significantly cheaper than the electricity price, which is the future for low carbon solutions. So I don't know if that helps.
It does, and it opens up the debate around financial investments, financial modelling, and financial budgeting for the future, and something that no doubt we will tackle in the larger roundtable discussion. But a really interesting take on how those two things marry. So thank you for that. So an environmentalist at heart, looking at your academic background, talk us through your kind of journey. When did that become significant for you?
So really, it was the 1990s, I suppose, when I was working in publishing. And I was working in Amsterdam with the background in physics. I was working on a lot of, let's say, physics-based journals and maths journals. And the Earth Summit had just happened. And as an organization, we were looking at whether we could start moving into the environment field. And I met someone called Keith Clayton. And he was a professor of coastal zone management at University of East Anglia. And we were talking about setting up a new journal, an environment journal. He was so passionate about what he did. I was so fascinated by his conversations that I decided that I needed to go and do a little bit more work and find out whether I really wanted to move into the environment and what it was I wanted to do in the environment. So he was my first inspiration. And so I decided to go off to Belize, where there was a conservation project which was looking at the Atlantic Barrier Reef. And I was just studying the reef and diving, and there was a lot of coral bleaching. And so someone who's just come out of theoretical physics, been working on, editorial journals on computational fluid dynamics, was looking at this and going, oh, right, okay, what are the issues and where is this coming from? What are the global solutions that we're looking at? Because this is such a significant natural good for all of us, having functioning coral reefs. And as I was underwater one day, I had a massive sort of wave of noise come over me and actually nearly flipped me out of the water. And what had happened is that about 5 kilometers up the reef, it had been dynamited, and 50 meters of reef had been dynamited. And what I found out was that it was to allow cruise ships through to port in Belize, so that obviously tourists could spend money in Belize. And that really started me on the journey that I was passionate about this reef I was working on, that it had just been blown up through some dynamite, and that it was to get money. And so I came back from that and thought, right, I've got to go and do a master's. I went to Professor Keith Clayton, who to say, I want to work with you. What am I going to do? What's the best areas of research that we can collaborate on? And he said, look, I'm retiring. So he guided me to a different professor called Professor Tim O'Riordan, who's also at University of East Anglia. And I suppose I spent 4 years collaborating with Tim O'Riordan, and also inspired by these collaborations, that it's just now been a passion from that point to make a difference. Now, initially, I thought that my difference was going to be working in, let's say, less developed countries at that time, until I was challenged by a chief exec of the Carbon Trust, who said to me, Sheryl, they're not where you should be working. You should be working in the developed countries and getting change happening in the developed countries, because it's our policies, our consumptions, our behaviours that are creating this. And I never thought I was going to go into local government. And that was the route to start making change. And and I've been in local government now 20 years, and it's been an amazing journey.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, and I suppose one that interestingly puts you on this precipice of coming back around full circle, which is around understanding the economic drivers and the payoffs. I suppose it led to my, well, I didn't know at the time, but leading to my first question around that dichotomy between the economic benefits and the environmental benefits, and the struggle between those two. So wow, what a fantastic story. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I guess throughout those experiences that you had, what's kind of the most important lesson you've learned along the way?
So it sort of came with your sort of opening question around economic models, which was that the models of the 20th century, economic models, don't function or aren't going to function in our 21st century, with 9 billion people predicted to be on our planet, and the levels of consumption and aspirations and culture of possessions. And so I think that until we can shift and move our economic aspirations, there is always going to be a significant challenge on degradation of our environment and degradation of our future. So the big thing is, how do you work within those economic systems to influence change? So that's my first lesson. There's so many lessons, Alex, but then my second one, and I think it's probably a more personal, local example, is you've got to build networks, you've got to build coalitions of resources with people who are also wanting to bring forward change and new thinking. And the power of putting together, multidisciplinary teams, working with the politics. And actually, one of my biggest lessons was just getting a good financial accountant to interpret what you're trying to do into languages of power. That's the thing that can really make the difference at a local level.
That again is something that I think will strike a chord with a number of our listeners, because one of the things that we as custodians of public spaces have is this challenge between wanting to get the job done and finding those necessary means and resources, all of which have some kind of cost associated to it, to come to the table to come up with a collective solution. And I think the point is very well made that it isn't one individual that can do this on their own. It is a collection and a collective of skills and experiences that will bring around that change that you're talking about. So I think it chimes very much with some of the other conversations that we've been having in this series. Just turning our attention more towards the sort of 2030 target of carbon net zero. I know Cambridgeshire County Council has stated that as a target for its operational buildings to be net carbon zero. I suppose it's a $1 million question, but what do we need to do differently to achieve that? And I suppose supplementary question, we are in 2021, approaching the midpoint in 2021. Cambridgeshire County Council has 450 million pounds worth of net book assets, or there or thereabouts, if I'm not mistaken. Is that achievable?
Okay, so the language of carbon is something that we all need to get educated and upskilled on. So when we talk about carbon emissions reductions, there's the discussion around what are we going to do as an organization, so just on our own operations with our own people. And that's tending to relate to something called scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And so that is the smallest part of our emissions at Cambridgeshire County Council. And this is associated with, the gas or oil use or energy use of our buildings and taking those off of fossil fuels. It's about our farm estate, as an example, our rural asset, which has a significant level of peatland, and agricultural practice can disturb CO2 emissions, and also can bring either be a sink or a source of carbon emissions. So it's how do we work with that? It's also about how are we getting people to and from work, and how do we do our business, which uses car miles potentially, and whether that's fossil fuels. But that's the easy stuff. What we have as a bigger impact is we have something called scope 3 emissions, and that's the £500 million of services that we procure from our supply chains. So the people who are delivering our adult social care, for example, could be Meals on Wheels, the people who are constructing the roads or the bridges. So for example, we have Skanska as one of our contractors. And it's how, with that £500 million of spend, are we influencing more broadly the changes to reduce carbon emissions? Now, we've got a target to reduce carbon emissions by 50% on our scope 3, which is our supply chain, by 2030. And so we're doing quite a lot of work currently to look at, well, how do you make this a level playing field for tenderers, so that when they are applying to do work for you and they're identifying their carbon emissions, that we've given them a tool so that they can calculate them, so that we can compare easily. Otherwise, there are so many methodologies for carbon accounting that you as a specifier of services where your skill set might not be in carbon would find it very difficult to discern between, this tenderer or that tenderer. But I think more importantly, and the bigger context is that, we all want to get to net zero by 2050. Government came out recently of, I think it was 78% by 2035 reductions. Unless we start aligning all of our policies, unless we don't have tensions in amongst and boundaries, organizational boundaries where people are pulling against each other, we're not going to get to even net zero at 2050. And one of the debates coming through at the moment is, what is this net part doing? So we had some work undertaken by Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange, which identified for Cambridgeshire, so that's everybody working and living in Cambridgeshire, the carbon emissions for the whole of Cambridgeshire. We're not going to get that to zero by 2050. There's always going to be a residual emission. And so the solutions for that residual emission are, how do you start thinking about using and developing carbon sinks, as an example, so tree planting, so how you manage your peat, how you look at your natural environment to build the assets that we had, which help to manage the global system of carbon that has helped us as humans live on this planet. And so where we've degraded habitats over the sort of centuries, we're needing to think about how we put back some of that nature to be able to allow us to have natural carbon sinks, along with all of these other mechanisms of cutting carbon emissions and cutting out fossil fuels. So sorry, that didn't quite, it's complex.
It's interesting because I suppose that opens up the avenue to saying, where we have greenfield and brownfield sites, actually, can we start to think differently and optimize those sites for carbon capture and carbon storage, as opposed to utilizing those sites for further development? And if the answer to that is more flexible planning regulations that allow us to use those sites potentially as carbon storage, but also rewilding those sites to bring environmental benefits, then potentially there are solutions that can come into play that make best use of the green space that we have, safeguarding that green space, but using it to stimulate carbon benefits for the rest of the sort of perhaps more urban environments in which we're working with.
Yes, and I think, so, you know, I was just reading an article yesterday. It's a new magazine called Perspectives, and someone called Rowan Pelling had interviewed Tony Juniper and his role as chair of Natural England. And, you know, working with government, the agricultural bill, the environment bill, which is now going to be working effectively with the private sector, so farmers, to pay I suppose, to make payments to manage our environment, to rewild, to store carbon, is a way of bringing back some of that public good, which has been lost through, I suppose, other economic development incentives, or just making money, trying to make ends meet. And so I find it very interesting that this, the future ELMS payment, so Environmental Land Management Scheme as an example, is going to be looking at landscape scale change for managing our environment. And I'm excited about that. That, along with, you know, using the planning system for biodiversity net gain as an example. The challenge we have is that building up natural systems to be effective takes time. And so we don't have time to wait to do that, to start working. You know, it's 30 years between now and 2050. 2050 isn't an absolute deadline. We want to get things working before. And so to build the capacities of those natural environments, we need to get things moving quickly now.
Absolutely. And just to pick up on the point that you made, and just so our listeners get a sense of scale between the tier 1 and tier 2 and the tier 3 emission scopes that we were talking about, what percentage of the total emissions is that tier 3 supply chain emissions? Is that 60%, 80%, 15%? Where is it in the sliding scale?
So for Cambridgeshire County Council, Our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are around 1%. The rest, so between 98%, 99%, are through our contracting processes. So if you want to have the scale of change and actually the leverages of change, it's how you use your procurement mechanisms to bring those around, because that's the private sector. It's using the market to bring change.
That's a really surprising statistic. I thought you were going to say it would be a much smaller percentage than 98%. That's fascinating. And I think it would be really interesting for those people listening to the podcast and Spaces members to go back into their own organizations and understand what that is, because in their own organizations, because I think that will absolutely start to determine really our strategy through how we're going to achieve net carbon zero by 2030 or by 2050, because I think many of us understand the why and the what, but not necessarily the how. And I think you've shown a massive spotlight, certainly on one area that would have massive net benefits for us all if the proportions are stacked towards the upper end for a number of local authorities. So thank you for sharing that with us, Sheryl. That's absolutely fascinating. And just finally, what kind of one piece of literature, article, documentary would you want our audience to review that perhaps might revolutionize their thinking on carbon reduction?
Okay, that's a really hard one, because I suppose I'm learning, I think we're all learning every day on how to manage our future and how to bring back a better environment. So there are things that inspired me in the 90s, there's things that inspired me in the noughties, and even today. So I'm going to give you the thing that most recently made me really think hard, and that was, you might have heard of the film Seaspiracy. So my husband and I watched it a few weeks back. I couldn't see it to the end. It was enough. I didn't need to see it to the end. But basically, the thing that I found difficult about it was that it was exposing sort of the systemic destruction of our environment, so our oceans and the animals living in the ocean. And it was all around profit. There was waste at a scale coming through that should not be allowed. Dolphins being killed because they eat fish, and the fish are the things that you're going to sell to make money. The fishing mechanisms that we use, there's things called byproducts, and these are the things that are caught in the net as a consequence of some of our commercial fishing practices, and they're larger than the actual fish that you're going to be selling in terms of quantum. And so I think the whole commercial farming of fishing or commercial farming mechanisms that we work or live with need fundamental change. So that's the thing that moved me the most recently. But if you're wanting something which is more an academic text, it's the Stern Report, which was back in 2006 to 8, somewhere in that. I'm not sure when it was published, around that time. And it's not something you can read all the way through. It's very difficult reading, and it wasn't my natural reading. I had to pick out chapters, but that was the thing which was talking about, if you don't do something, it's going to be so much more costly in the future. If you don't start investment on a reasonable scale now, the costs of insurance through climate change, weather patterns coming forward was going to be bigger than what your costs are now. And I think that's the biggest thing.
Okay, that's fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And Sheryl, thank you very much for joining us on this podcast. It's been absolutely enlightening for me and hopefully for our audience. And we will look forward to seeing you at the roundtable discussion. Sheryl French, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.